You, Miss McCurley?
I am.
And Mr. McCurley?
He's in the back.
Mr. McCurley?
I didn't do anything.
This is 77-year-old Glenn McCurley. He's suspected of having kidnapped and killed up to 7 women and girls in Fort Worth between 1967 and 1985. For almost 50 years, he has...
An old man opens his front door, expecting a routine knock. Instead, he finds a detective standing there with a question that has been waiting nearly half a century to be asked. He smiles at first. He jokes. He thinks he has beaten the system, the way he has beaten it for 46 years. He has no idea that a single straw pulled from his own trash is about to end his life as a free man. This is a story of a 17-year-old girl named Carla Walker, the little brother who refused to let her be forgotten, and the science that finally caught up to a killer who thought he had gotten away with it forever. In February of 1974, Fort Worth, Texas, was the kind of place where a Valentine's Day dance still felt like the biggest event of the school year. Carla Walker was 17, a senior, the kind of girl teachers remembered fondly and classmates admired without envy. She was smart, warm, and popular in the way that comes from being genuinely kind rather than simply well-liked. Her boyfriend was Rodney McCoy, 18 years old and completely devoted to her. For months he had been saving up for something special, a small gold ring with a rose and a single diamond, a promise ring meant to tell Carla that he saw a future with her. When he gave it to her before the dance, her reaction told him everything he needed to know. She loved it, and more importantly, she loved him. That night the two of them danced with their friends, laughed the way teenagers do when the world still feels safe, and then slipped away afterward to spend a few quiet minutes alone together, the way countless young couples had done before them on countless ordinary nights. It should have been unremarkable. Instead, it became the last normal night of Carla Walker's life. While they sat together in Rodney's car, a stranger appeared at the door and yanked it open. Rodney barely had time to register what was happening before he was struck across the face with the butt of a handgun. The attacker's weapon had jammed, and as he worked to clear it, Rodney realized with horror that the man intended to shoot him. It was Carla who stopped it. She told the man to leave Rodney alone, that she would go with him willingly if he did. Whatever fear she must have felt in that instant, she pushed it aside to save the boy she loved. Rodney would later say that those were the last words he ever heard her speak. Bleeding and half-conscious, he watched her being taken, and then he did the only thing he could do. He drove, dazed and in shock, back toward home. Carla's younger brother Jim was 12 years old that night, asleep on the living room couch when he was jolted awake by the sound of tires screeching outside. Moments later he heard Rodney's voice, frantic and broken, calling for their father. Jim ran outside to find his sister's boyfriend stumbling across the lawn, his face covered in blood, the passenger seat of his car empty. Carla was gone. What followed was 3 days of searching that consumed the entire community. Police, FBI agents, and volunteers combed the area for any sign of her. Then a detective remembered a case from the year before, a young woman named Becky Martin, who had been found dead inside a drainage culvert on the outskirts of the city. Acting on that grim instinct, searchers turned their attention to the underground tunnels scattered across the countryside. It was there, in one of those culverts, that Carla's body was discovered. The Walker family would never be the same. In the aftermath, suspicion fell hard and fast on Rodney McCoy. He was the only witness, the boyfriend, the last person seen with her, and to a grieving and frightened town that was enough to make a target. Classmates whispered about him. Neighbors eyed him with distrust. And yet the one family who never doubted him was the Walkers themselves. Rodney had been so close to Carla's parents that in the days after her death, unable to face being alone, he stayed at their house and slept in her bed, a small act of trust that spoke volumes about how little they believed he was responsible. At Carla's funeral, more than 1,000 people came to pay their respects. Rodney stood among them, carrying both his grief and the weight of a town's suspicion. When he approached her casket for one final look, he noticed the promise ring was missing from her finger. It had somehow ended up in the culvert beside her body, and to this day no one knows for certain whether it was taken deliberately or torn away in a struggle. Not long after graduation, unable to bear the shadow that had settled over his life in Fort Worth, Rodney left for Alaska to work on an oil rig, and for decades he never came back. For young Jim Walker, his sister's murder became the defining wound of his childhood. Consumed by grief and a growing, simmering anger, he began sleeping in the very culvert where Carla's body had been found, hoping against hope that her killer might return to the scene and that he, only a boy, would somehow be ready for him. It never happened, but the desire for justice never left him either. As soon as he was old enough, Jim applied to the police academy, determined to become the kind of investigator who could solve the case himself. He was accepted, and for a moment it seemed like he might get the chance to fight for his sister in a uniform. Then his vision began to fail him without warning, blurring during one of his exams. Doctors eventually diagnosed him with a rare genetic condition that would leave him legally blind, ending his path into law enforcement before it truly began. Life did not get easier from there. One by one, Jim's siblings left Fort Worth to build lives elsewhere, until by the year 2020, he was the last member of his family still living in the city where Carla died. His marriage was struggling. His father had passed away, carrying, Jim believed, the unspoken guilt of never seeing his daughter's killer brought to justice. Not long after, his mother died too, and Jim has always suspected that grief played its own quiet role in her death. Yet through all of it, one thing never wavered. Every single year, Jim picked up the phone and called the Fort Worth Police Department, asking, sometimes pleading, for someone to reopen his sister's case. He was once told the department was juggling more than 900 unsolved murders. His answer was simple and unshakable. His heart ached for every one of those families, but he only had the strength to fight for one. That persistence eventually reached the desk of Detective Leah Wagner, the department's cold case investigator. As a mother herself, something about Carla's story struck her on a personal level, and she made the decision to reopen the file. For Jim, after 46 years of disappointment, it was the first real flicker of hope he had felt in a long time. Wagner started from scratch, poring over decades-old evidence boxes that had somehow survived intact. A jammed pistol magazine left at the scene, Carla's torn clothing, and the promised ring itself. What she needed most, though, was DNA, and she got a breakthrough when she learned that a partial male genetic profile had already been recovered from Carla's clothing back in 2009. It was a start, but only a start. The sample was tiny, a few nanograms at most, far smaller than anything Wagner had worked with before, and any attempt to analyze it further risked destroying it completely. Worse, the partial profile did not match anyone already in the criminal database. It was enough to rule people out, but nowhere near enough to identify a suspect. The answer came from a private laboratory using next-generation forensic genealogy techniques, capable of building usable profiles from vanishingly small amounts of DNA. It was a gamble that would consume the last of the sample with no guarantee of success, but Wagner and Jim agreed it was worth the risk. It paid off. The lab returned a name, Glenn McCurley, a 77-year-old man who, remarkably, had already crossed paths with the original 1970 for investigation. Back then, police had questioned every registered owner of the type of pistol whose magazine was found at the crime scene, and McCurley had been one of dozens of names on that list. He had even taken a polygraph test at the time and passed it. DNA, however, does not lie and does not forget. Investigators discovered that McCurley had never left Fort Worth. He was living only a few miles from the very site where Carla had been abducted. An officer was sent to speak with him under the pretext of a routine conversation. At first, McCurley treated it almost as a joke, relaxed and dismissive. But as the questions grew more specific, his demeanor shifted, and when he began constructing an alibi for the days surrounding Carla's disappearance, it was his own wife who unknowingly undercut him, correcting details of his story without realizing what was at stake. McCurley was under no legal obligation to provide a DNA sample, and he refused. So investigators turned to another method entirely. That night, officers quietly went through his household trash and recovered a discarded plastic drinking straw. It was enough. The genetic material on it matched the decades-old sample, and with that, detectives finally had the probable cause they needed for an arrest warrant. On September 21, 2020, Glenn McCurley was taken into custody. During his interrogation, faced with DNA evidence that left no room for denial, he ultimately admitted to killing Carla Walker. Jim Walker has described that phone call from Detective Wagner as one of the most emotional moments of his life. He immediately called Rodney McCoy, the boyfriend who had carried the unfair weight of suspicion for nearly half a century, and told him simply, "We got him." There was a long pause on the line before Rodney could even respond. But the story did not end cleanly there. When Wagner pressed McCurley to describe exactly where he had left Carla's body, his answer did not match the actual location where she had been found. It was a small but chilling detail, one that suggested Carla may not have been his only victim. When investigators tried to push further, McCurley shut down completely, refusing to say anything more. It raised a haunting possibility that has never been fully resolved, that between 1967 and 1985, several other women and girls disappeared or were killed in the Fort Worth area under disturbingly similar circumstances, and that McCurley may be connected to some or all of those unsolved cases. For Jim, the confession did not bring the vengeance he had once imagined as a grieving, furious 12-year-old sleeping in a drainage tunnel. Instead, decades of anger gave way to something he never expected: compassion, not for McCurley himself, but for the people left in the wreckage of what he had done, including McCurley's own family. Chief among them was Roddy McCurley, the killer's son, who begged his father in the days before trial to admit to any other crimes he may have committed, hoping it might bring peace to other families and perhaps some redemption for his own name. He later described looking into his father's eyes and finding nothing there at all, no remorse, no acknowledgement, only a wall. The trial began in August of 2021 in a Tarrant County courtroom, 47 years after Carla's murder. Rodney McCoy returned to Fort Worth to testify, closing a circle that had been open his entire adult life. Jim sat in the courtroom, aware not only of his own family's pain, but of the quiet suffering of the McCurleys nearby. After one difficult day of testimony, Jim made a choice that surprised almost everyone who knew his story. He approached Roddy McCurley, introduced himself, and asked if he could give him a hug. He told him plainly that he was not responsible for his father's sins and did not have to carry that weight. For Roddy, it was a moment of unexpected grace from the very family his father had destroyed. The next day, Jim, Rodney, and the McCurley family sat near one another in that courtroom, an unlikely alliance of survivors. As the judge called the session to order, something shifted in Glenn McCurley. He leaned toward his attorney, said a few quiet words, and the courtroom was abruptly adjourned. Before testimony could resume, McCurley changed his plea to guilty. Judge Elizabeth Beach sentenced him to life in prison. Inside the courtroom, decades of suppressed grief finally broke into the open. Tears not just of sorrow, but of long-delayed relief. To mark the end of the case, Jim and Detective Wagner arranged one final gesture for Rodney McCoy, returning to him something that had been missing from his life for 46 years. Carla's promise ring, the one small piece of that Valentine's night that had never truly been accounted for. Rodney has said it was one of the most meaningful gifts he has ever received, a small but powerful piece of closure after decades defined by suspicion and grief that were never his to carry. Today, Glenn McCurley is known publicly as the Valentine's Day Killer, believed by investigators to be connected to as many as 7 murders of women and girls in the Fort Worth area between 1967 and 1985, though he was ultimately convicted only in Carla's case. The breakthrough that finally caught him has had ripple effects far beyond this one family. Texas lawmakers have pushed legislation named in Carla Walker's honor, aimed at funding the kind of advanced forensic DNA technology that took a 5-nanogram sample and turned it into a name, a warrant, and finally, a confession. The hope is that other cold cases, other grieving families like the Walkers, might one day get the same chance at answers. As for Jim Walker, he remains close with both Detective Wagner and Rodney McCoy, the two people who stood beside him through the final chapter of his sister's story. Remarkably, he has also built a genuine friendship with Roddy McCurley, offering him the same forgiveness and steadiness that carried Jim himself through nearly 5 decades of unanswered pain. What began as a 12-year-old boy's vow of revenge became, in the end, something far more powerful, proof that patience, love, and the refusal to give up can outlast even the most stubborn silence, and that justice delayed does not always mean justice denied.